The market air was thick, heavy with the coppery smell of rain and rust. You could hear the clinking of chains, a sound like the slow, tired heartbeat of shame. On a raised platform, under the sickly yellow glow of artificial sun lamps, stood the girl they called Lot 47, half-breed, unclaimed, defective. Her eyes were the dead giveaway. One was the silver of her Vorlian mother, the other a deep terrestrial green. It was the mark of her mixed blood, a secret her powerful family just couldn't hide anymore. She was the cast-off daughter of a fallen alien house, sold to the highest bidder to cover a catastrophic debt. Start the bid at 500 credits. The auctioneer barked, his voice cracking through the quiet murmurs of slavers and off-world colonists. The girl, Lyra, didn't even flinch. She'd learned a long time ago that flinching only makes the crowd hungrier. But then a new voice cut through the quiet. 500, it said, flat and heavy. And no higher, heads turned. Near the back stood a human. His shoulders were broad but slumped with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. He wore the rough, stained coat of a farmer from the outer colonies, and his face was a mask that said he'd buried more dreams than he could count. Nobody knew why the widower from the red-dusted world of Eden 3 was there, or why he was about to buy a bastard alien that nobody else wanted. The gavel struck with a dead final sound. The chain was released from the floor, and just like that, Captain Kalen Harrow, a widower from the colony world Eden 3, owned Lyra, the half-alien girl. The journey to his home was a study in silence. His ship was an old, patched-together cargo hauler that groaned with every single shift in gravity. Lyra sat bolted to a metal bench, watching the man who now owned her life. For hours, Kalen didn't speak. He just stared out of the viewport as the starlight traced the old scars on his face. He wasn't like the other buyers she'd had to endure. There was no cruel glint in his eye, no possessive sneer. There was just nothing. A vast hollow emptiness that seemed to swallow all the light around him. Lyra had been trained to be obedient, to guess what a new master wanted, but she couldn't get a read on this man. He was a ghost piloting a ghost ship through the forgotten corners of the galaxy. Her fear, which was always with her, started to curdle into a new kind of dread. A cruel master was predictable. A broken one was a mystery, and mysteries were dangerous. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "You hungry?" he asked. He didn't wait for an answer, just tossed a protein bar onto the seat beside her. It was real food, not the nutrient paste she was used to. Lyra waited a full 20 minutes, watching him for any sign of a trick, before she finally ate it in 3 desperate bites. They landed on Eden 3 as its twin suns were setting, casting long skeletal shadows across a landscape of red dust and rock. The station was modest, just a cluster of habitat domes linked by tunnels, surrounded by the promise of a farm that hadn't quite bloomed yet. It looked less like a slaver's compound and more like a monument to loneliness. Kalen led her through the quiet corridors, his heavy boots echoing in the stillness. He didn't push her or drag her. He just walked, and she followed, the weight of her new reality settling in with every single step. He stopped in front of a simple metal door. It wasn't the master suite she was braced for, but a small, unassuming room at the far end of the habitat. He pressed a panel, and the door slid open to reveal a clean, sparse, and empty space. It held a simple cot, not a master's bed. "This is yours," he said simply. He pointed to the control panel on the inside. "The door locks from in here." Lyra stared at the lock. She had never had a door that locked from the inside. It was a power she'd never been given, the power to keep someone out. She finally looked up at him, her 2 different colored eyes searching his face for the trick, the angle, the lie. Kalen cleared his throat, a raw, awkward sound. "Look, I know what you're probably thinking, what you've probably been through." His voice cracked, and it was the first real emotion she'd heard from him. It wasn't anger. It was pain. "That's not what this is." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, flickering hollow photo. It showed a human girl with dark hair and her father's kind eyes, grinning in an oversized worksuit. "I lost my daughter 3 years ago," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "Her name was Emma. She was about your age. After she was gone, my wife and we couldn't." The quiet was just too loud. He pocketed the photo, his hand lingering over his heart. "I'm not trying to replace her." "Nobody could," he went on, finally meeting her gaze. "But this station is too quiet. And according to the Galactic Labor Commission, you needed a placement away from Vorlian space. So here we are." That was the shock. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't violence. It wasn't the brutal night she had been braced for her entire life. The shock was kindness. The man who had bought her didn't see a piece of property. He saw a child who needed a safe place to land, and in her, he saw a way to quiet the ghosts that haunted his empty home. He hadn't bought a slave. He'd rescued a soul, hoping it might somehow help rescue his own. Lyra stood in the doorway of her new room, a room with a lock, and for the first time in her life felt the terrifying, unfamiliar bloom of safety. Days bled into weeks on Eden 3. The rhythm of the station was slow, dictated by the cycles of the hydroponics bay and the low hum of the atmospheric processors. In that quiet, a fragile, unspoken trust began to form between them. It was built on small things. Kaylin would leave her meals by her door, never demanding she eat with him, but the food was always warm. He showed her how to tend to the tomato plants, patiently explaining photosynthesis with his clumsy grasp of her native dialect. In return, Lyra slowly began to reveal parts of herself. One day, Kaylin found a withered plant in the med bay, a species from his wife's homeworld that hadn't bloomed in years. Now it was covered in delicate white flowers. He never asked how she did it. He just looked at her, a flicker of something like wonder in his tired eyes. She had a small, latent psychic ability from her Vorlian heritage, the power to nurture life, to feel the emotional pulse of living things. It wasn't a weapon, just a quiet act of creation. They started to talk. He'd tell her stories about Emma, not the sad ones, but funny memories worn smooth from retelling. She, in turn, told him about her life as a bastard, an embarrassment to a noble house, hidden away until she could be sold off. They were two outcasts. Really, a man haunted by the family he'd lost, and a girl rejected by the family she'd never had, finding common ground in their shared loneliness. The sterile habitat began to feel like a home. Her laughter, a sound she thought had died in her years ago, started to echo in the corridors, mixing with his low, steady voice. He wasn't just her protector. He was becoming her friend. And for him, she was no longer a reminder of what he'd lost, but a reason to look toward the sunrise. But that peace was shattered by the scream of an engine tearing through Eden 3's thin atmosphere. A sleek, black ship, bearing the crest of the Vorlian Guild, descended from the sky and landed heavily on the red dust just 100 yards from the main dome. The people who had sold Lyra were back. The ramp lowered and a group of armored Vorlian officers marched out. They were led by a man whose cold, silver eyes were a perfect mirror of Lyra's own. "It was her uncle. The asset has been located," the officer announced, his voice amplified and completely empty of warmth. "By order of the high houses, Lot 47 is to be retrieved." Kaylin stepped out of the habitat, placing himself squarely between the soldiers and the door where Lyra stood watching, her heart hammering against her ribs. "She's not an asset," Kaylin said, his voice dangerously calm. "Her name is Lyra, and she's not going anywhere." Lyra's uncle sneered. "Human, you purchased defective goods, a simple hybrid with a parlor trick. But new information has come to light. Her trick is far more valuable than we knew. We've learned she doesn't just make flowers grow. She has the potential for large-scale biogenesis. She can terraform. She is not a person. She is the most valuable resource in the quadrant, and she belongs to us." "She belongs with me," Kaylin growled, raising a heavy-duty plasma rifle he kept with his farm equipment. The Vorlians immediately raised their weapons in response. But before anyone could fire a shot, something impossible happened. The dead red ground around the habitat began to shift. Thick, thorny vines erupted from the dust, twisting into a defensive wall of living barricades. The air shimmered as Lyra stepped forward, her hands outstretched, her eyes glowing with a power she was only just beginning to understand. She wasn't just nurturing one plant. She was speaking to the very potential of life in the soil, awakening the planet's dormant will to live. Shocked, the Vorlians opened fire. Kaylin returned it, using his knowledge of the terrain to create choke points, shouting commands that Lyra followed without a second thought. They fought as one, his tactical skill and her world-bending power, a united front born from trust and love. The battle was short and decisive. Faced with a man who would die for her, and a girl who could turn an entire planet against them, the Vorlians retreated, their black ship blasting away into the sky. In the aftermath, Kaylin and Lyra stood together amidst the newly formed impossible garden. The silence that returned wasn't the empty, grieving silence of before. It was a silence filled with peace and a shared victory. He looked at her, no longer a broken man looking at a purchased girl, but as a partner, a true equal. They had saved each other from their pasts, and in doing so, they had created a future, a small green oasis in a universe of red dust. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the future holds for Kaylin and Lyra on their new world? We love reading your ideas and theories. Thank you for being a part of our community.